Every night, after his wife falls asleep, Daniel does the same thing. He waits. He listens to her breathing even out. And then, in the dark, he opens her phone. He isn't looking for anything anymore. He already found it. 2 weeks ago, he read a message that changed everything. Words another man had sent his wife, describing, in detail, exactly what he planned to do to her the next time they were alone. You know what he told her to expect? 3 hours. He told her to expect 3 hours. Daniel didn't say a word. He didn't confront her. He didn't cry, not at first. He just closed the phone, put it back exactly where he found it, and lay down next to the woman who still, every single morning, tells him she loves him. This is the story of a husband who found out his wife was cheating, and instead of falling apart, quietly built a case. Daniel is 28. His wife, Claire, is 26. They grew up a few states apart, both raised in households that valued discretion, tradition, and keeping family matters private. The kind of upbringing where you didn't air your dirty laundry, where a marriage was something you protected, not something you talked about. They met in their early 20s, dated for a while, and eventually got married. Before the wedding, Daniel knew. In the vague way people know these things, that Claire had a more eventful dating history than he did. He never asked for a number. He never wanted one. As far as he was concerned, whoever they'd been before didn't matter. They'd both settled down. They'd both chosen each other. And for 2.5 years, that choice looked like it was working. They traveled together. They talked, really talked, about their feelings, their fears, their future. There weren't blowout fights, no slammed doors, no silent treatments that stretched into days. If you'd asked Daniel, even a month before all of this started, how his marriage was going, he would have told you it was good. Not perfect, no marriage is, but good, steady, something he trusted. That trust is the whole point of this story. Because what makes what happens next so disorienting isn't just the betrayal itself, it's how normal everything looked right up until the moment it wasn't. Daniel didn't go looking for trouble. Trouble found him by accident on an ordinary afternoon because he forgot his wallet. It was a few weeks ago. Daniel had already left for the day. Kissed Claire goodbye, gotten in the car, pulled out of the driveway. When he realized he'd left something behind. Nothing dramatic. Just one of those small, everyday reasons to turn around. He let himself back in quietly, more out of habit than anything else, and that's when he heard her voice from another room. She was on the phone, giggling. Light, playful, the kind of laugh Daniel hadn't heard directed at him in a while. Not because anything was wrong, just because that's what happens after a few years of marriage. The butterflies mellow out. You get comfortable. Except Claire didn't sound comfortable. She sounded thrilled. She sounded like someone brand new to being wanted. Daniel stood frozen in the entryway, halfway between the front door and the rest of his own house, and listened to his wife's tone shift into something he only half recognized. Something that used to be reserved for him, back when they were newly engaged and couldn't keep their hands off each other. Then she said something that stopped his heart cold. "You'd better make it worth my while. At least 3 hours, or don't bother." He didn't move. He didn't breathe. Not really. For a few seconds, his brain simply refused to process what his ears had just handed it. Then, quietly, carefully, the way you'd sneak out of a house rather than into one, Daniel let himself back out the front door. He stood on the porch for a moment, making sure the latch hadn't given him away, and then he walked to his car like nothing had happened. He drove to work that day, and he has no memory of the drive at all. Here's the thing about a moment like that. It doesn't come with a manual. Daniel didn't burst back through the door and demand answers. He didn't call Claire right then and confront her over the phone. He did something a lot of people in his position do, something he's not entirely proud of, but something that would end up mattering more than almost anything else in this story. He waited. That night, he stayed up. Not obviously. No pacing, no confrontation, nothing that would tip Claire off that anything was different. He just let her fall asleep first, the way she always did, curled slightly away from him, breathing slow and even. And once he was sure she was really out, Daniel got up, walked quietly to another room, and picked up her phone. He searched her messages. Nothing. Whoever she'd been talking to that morning wasn't in her regular texts, wasn't saved as a contact, wasn't anywhere obvious. For a second, he almost let himself believe he'd imagined the whole thing. Misheard her, jumped to conclusions, built a nightmare out of nothing. Then he checked, recently deleted, and there it was. An unsaved number. Over 1,100 messages. 1,100 messages doesn't sound like much until you start reading them one by one at 2 in the morning, sitting on the edge of a bathtub so the light won't wake your wife up in the next room. It wasn't just sexual content, though there was plenty of that. Explicit descriptions of what they'd done together, what they planned to do next, photos and videos, some of them showing both of their faces clearly enough that there'd be no arguing about who they were. It was the ordinary stuff mixed in with it that hit Daniel harder. Check-ins about her day. Little jokes. The kind of low-stakes, comfortable intimacy that's supposed to belong to a marriage. The stuff Daniel thought was his. There were messages where Claire talked about how careful she'd been, how she'd managed to keep this hidden. There were messages from the other man. Someone Daniel now knew was almost certainly single, telling her he was tired of sharing her, that he wanted her to leave her husband so they could actually be together, out in the open, without any of this sneaking around. Daniel put the phone back exactly where it had been. He got back into bed next to his wife. He did not sleep. That became the routine. Every night for the next 2 weeks, once Claire was asleep, Daniel would quietly go through her phone, not to torture himself, though it did, but to stay current, to know what was actually happening instead of just what had already happened. And that's how he knew, on an otherwise unremarkable morning, that today was different. He told Claire that morning he'd be working from home. It wasn't unusual. He did it now and then. What was unusual was her reaction. A flash of something across her face. Annoyance, maybe. She pushed back, gently but noticeably, suggesting he go into the office instead, something about him being home a lot lately. An hour later, she told him she was meeting up with a friend. She got dressed the way you get dressed when you're trying to look effortless while trying very, very hard. Full makeup. A little extra care in front of the mirror. Daniel already knew, from the messages he'd read the night before, exactly where she was going and exactly why. And exactly why she'd pushed back on his day off. He wasn't guessing anymore. He wasn't piecing together suspicions. He was sitting in his own living room, watching his wife walk out the door to be with another man, and he already had the receipts in his back pocket. This is the part that's almost harder to sit with than the affair itself. That same afternoon, before she left, she told him she loved him, the way she always did, like nothing in the world was wrong. Either Claire is an extraordinary actress, or she has found a way to hold two completely contradictory realities in her head at the same time. The version of herself that adores her husband, and the version that's about to spend the afternoon with someone else. Daniel isn't sure which one scares him more. He didn't stop her. He didn't say a word. He let her walk out the door, and once she was gone, he sat with the screenshots he'd already saved. Texts, photos, timestamps, all of it backed up and sent to himself, quietly, methodically, over 2 weeks of sleepless nights. He wasn't ready to blow up his life yet, but he was, for the first time since that morning by the front door, no longer powerless. When Daniel first posted his story online, the response was immediate and split in a few different directions. A large group of commenters zeroed in on the evidence gathering itself, urging him to talk to a lawyer as soon as possible and make sure everything he'd collected would actually hold up if things got contentious. Screenshots, they warned, aren't always enough on their own. Timestamps and originals matter. Another group focused on his emotional state, gently pointing out that reading through explicit messages every night for 2 weeks, alone, in the dark, wasn't just information gathering. It was a slow, repeated form of self-harm, and they worried about what that kind of routine does to a person over time. A smaller, more cynical corner of the comments assumed the worst about Claire almost instantly, treating the affair as proof of some deeper character flaw rather than a single, devastating decision. Arguing that anyone capable of pulling this off for weeks without a flicker of guilt showing on her face wasn't safe to stay married to, full stop. Others pushed back on that framing entirely, pointing out that Daniel himself had said Claire seemed to feel genuine guilt in some of the messages, and that people are frequently capable of both loving someone and betraying them, which doesn't make the betrayal smaller. just more human. And then there was the practical contingent. The ones asking what almost everyone eventually asks in stories like this. Does the other man know he's involved with a married woman? And does anyone plan to tell him? Daniel read all of it. And a little while later, he came back with more. In a follow-up, Daniel clarified a few things he felt he'd left vague the first time around. Mostly because, in his words, he hadn't expected many people to actually read the post. First, yes, he had already contacted a lawyer. And yes, the screenshots he'd been sending himself, including photos where both faces were clearly visible, were the evidence he was building his case around. The lawyer seemed confident it was enough. Second, and more pointed, he wanted people to understand that when he'd originally asked for advice, he hadn't been asking whether to leave the marriage. That decision was already made. What he'd actually wanted input on was how to approach Claire once everything was out in the open. How to have that conversation, not whether to have it. He also revealed something he hadn't mentioned before. He genuinely loved his in-laws. Claire's parents had welcomed him into their family without hesitation, and given how strict his and Claire's upbringings had been, Daniel wanted to protect them from the ugliest details of what their daughter had done. Not for Claire's sake, for theirs. His plan, going in, was simple. Lay out the evidence. Offer her a clean, fast, quiet divorce. One that let her reputation stay mostly intact, in exchange for her not fighting him on the split or trying to spin him as the villain to her family. And then, almost as an afterthought, he mentioned that Claire had come home the evening after that meetup acting completely normal, as if nothing had happened at all. Which brings us to the part of the story where things stop being suspicion and start being certainty. Claire walked in that evening with a story ready to go. Something about a friend, some gossip, nothing memorable enough for Daniel to even bother repeating. He already knew where she'd actually been. He'd confirmed the hotel that same night, reading through fresh messages and new photos the other man had sent her afterward, documenting their time together in detail neither of them expected anyone else to ever see. Daniel sent those to himself too, quietly, the way he'd been doing everything for 2 weeks now. What unsettled him most, he admitted, wasn't the affair itself anymore. He'd had time to sit with that. It was how seamlessly Claire could return to normal. No guilt written across her face. No distance in her voice. No slip-ups. People always say infidelity comes with tells. A partner who gets cagey with their phone, distant in bed, irritable for no reason. Daniel says if he hadn't overheard that one phone call by accident, he might genuinely still believe his marriage was fine. This could have gone on for years, he realized, and he would have had no idea. I really don't think they're going to end up together once we're split, he wrote. If anything, she may end up resenting him, because buried in those 1,100 messages was something almost nobody expected. The other man had asked Claire, more than once, to leave her husband and be with him properly. Not just meet up in secret. Actually be together. And Claire, by all appearances, wasn't interested. She'd talk about how good a husband Daniel was, even mid-affair, even while planning her next meetup. She admitted, in her own words, to feeling guilty. Whatever this was to her, it wasn't a plan to build a new life with someone else. It was something else entirely. Something Daniel has stopped trying to fully understand, because understanding it isn't going to change what he does next. He didn't try to find out how the affair started, either. Claire and the other man didn't work together, didn't go to the same gym, didn't run in any shared circles that Daniel could identify. Somewhere along the way, on some platform he hasn't traced, two strangers found each other, and it grew from there. He says if he ever finds out, he'll share it. For now, it doesn't matter. The how isn't the part he needs closure on. Quick note before we get into the last stretch of this. If you're finding yourself invested in how this plays out, it helps a lot if you hit subscribe. All right, back to it. As for the other man, several commenters had pushed Daniel to expose him, to reach out to his job, to make sure whatever came next for him wasn't quiet or painless. Daniel considered it, briefly, and decided against it. From what he'd read in those messages, he didn't think the guy needed his help looking pathetic. If sleeping with a married woman is the high point of his life, Daniel said, that's a problem he gets to keep. His focus, instead, stayed entirely on the exit. Claire was set to leave soon for a week-long trip with her family. A trip planned long before any of this came to light. Daniel saw it as an opportunity. While she was away, he intended to finalize everything with his lawyer, make sure every piece of evidence was properly organized and admissible, and have the entire conversation ready to go the moment she walked back through the door. His terms were straightforward, and he'd already decided he wasn't going to negotiate them. A quick, quiet divorce. No dragging it out. No exposing her to her family in graphic detail. She could tell them whatever story she wanted, as long as it didn't paint Daniel as the reason the marriage ended. In exchange, he'd spare her parents. The in-laws he'd genuinely come to love, from ever knowing the specifics of what their daughter had done. It's worth sitting with what kind of restraint that actually takes. Daniel isn't protecting Claire. He said, plainly, that he doesn't owe her that anymore. He's protecting two people who did nothing wrong except welcome him into their family, and who would carry this the rest of their lives if they knew the truth. So that's where things stand. A husband who found out, by accident, that his marriage wasn't what it looked like, who spent 2 weeks reading his own devastation one message at a time instead of confronting it head-on, who built a case, quietly, methodically, while his wife kept telling him she loved him every single day. And now, all that's left is the conversation, the one where he finally stops watching and starts speaking. If there's a lesson in Daniel's story, it isn't really about catching someone in the act. It's about what happens after you catch them. The version of yourself you become in the space between finding out and deciding what to do about it. Daniel didn't scream. He didn't confront Claire in the moment, even though every instinct probably told him to. He gathered what he needed, protected the people who didn't deserve to get hurt by this, and prepared to walk away with his dignity intact. Even while his heart was, by his own account, still breaking a little more every single night. Not everyone would have that kind of patience. Not everyone should have to. So here's the question we'll leave you with. If you found out the person you loved had been living a double life for who knows how long, would you confront them the second you knew? Or would you do exactly what Daniel did and wait until you had every piece of the truth in your hands first? Let us know in the comments. We read every one.